People coming in. Hi, everybody. I'm Rabbi Jessica Zimmerman Graf, Senior Rabbi at Congregation Sherith Israel, and together with my colleague Gordon Gladstone, our Executive Director, we are so delighted to welcome you today for our conversation from the front lines with our very special guest, Daniel Sokatch, who is the CEO of the New Israel Fund, which many of you may know. As people are still joining us here, I think we're going to have people joining us for a few minutes. I'll say, before I officially introduce Daniel, that the New Israel Fund is an organization very near and dear to my heart. I was involved with New Generations, which is the young adults committee in New York when I lived there, and I went on an absolutely life-changing trip with NIF to Israel a number of years ago that changed my understanding of Israel, of the complexity of Israeli society, and really made me feel passionate about making a difference in civil society in Israel. I went back, I think, 6 times in the next 3 years, and always connected to a New Israel Fund day of learning, because it was just so impactful and so powerful, and remains to this day the most important trip I think that I've ever taken of many trips to Israel. So happy to have the New Israel Fund based here with a wonderful group of people working in the office and wonderful lay leaders behind the scenes as well. And it's really our privilege to be able to talk about crazy politics in Israel and crazy politics around the world with someone who understands the crazy politics, because I am looking forward to learning more about the reality of what this all means. So Daniel Sokatch is the CEO of the New Israel Fund. He is in his 12th year in that position. He's served many roles in the organized and not so organized Jewish community over the years. He was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, some of you may have heard of, who have done a lot of work to bring justice into the Jewish world in all of its forms and realms. That organization is now called Bend the Arc, and many of you may have heard of that as well. Daniel and people like Daniel who care so much about not only American Judaism, but the conversation with Israel and about what our responsibility is to Israel are so important as we continue to grow as a people and as a nation, and as we, far away here in San Francisco, continue to connect. So I'm not sure where to look. Am I looking there? Am I looking?
Yeah, look at the camera. I don't know.
I haven't figured out Zoom yet, but I'll get there right when we go back to being in person. Yes, we are in person in my office, which is also thrilling. We've all been hugging and hugging. We're very excited to be here and look forward to being
Shh, don't tell the health officer.
back together with all of you soon. So I'm going to let Gordon maybe kick us off with some questions.
Yeah. So Daniel, great to have you here. I just want to say, starting off, I mourn the loss of the New Generations dinner, which was always the best networking cocktail hour in town, bar none.
We'll be back.
Okay, fantastic. I will get my cocktail hand ready. All right, so as people who have been listening to me natter on about the 5th of May for the last couple of weeks, I made up a Jewish holiday. Chamishi Lamai. Comes after Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, Yom Chamishi Lamai. I've been saying, oh, the Israeli elections are like a telenovela that you could not make up. Brazilian scriptwriters would tear their hair out. I go, no, not, it's too fantastical. Where are we right now? Here we are, it's Wednesday afternoon. Things have happened in the last 24 hours. What's a haps?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me to the community, and to you, Rabbi, and Gordon. And it's great to see so many friendly faces out there, both from the shul and also from NIF and the overlap. I'd like to extend a particular greeting to my colleagues. I have 2 colleagues who I can see on the call, Sherith and Orly, 2 terrific, 2 of those NIF staffers who you
Becky's
mentioned.
Out there too.
Oh, and Becky too.
Right
Great.
Yeah.
And Becky as well. And to so many of those wonderful NIF lay leaders that you mentioned, Rabbi, who I can see on the camera, on the list as well. And just on a personal note, it really is so nice to be in person. This is my first in-person event, or quasi in-person, since February, since the NIF board meeting in February of 2020. So
we should have started off with a Shechianu.
I was about to say, it's kind of a Shechianu moment. So it's really nice to be with. We're all vaccinated, of course, and it's good to be with you both. So the election. Where are we with the election? All right, so where we are with the election, as many people know, as of midnight Tuesday into Wednesday, Israel time, Prime Minister Netanyahu had to hand back essentially the mandate given to him by President Rivlin to try to establish a coalition. He failed. It is not the first time over the last 2 years that he failed. But let's take a quick step back and remind ourselves of a few things. One, Israeli elections, as I think most of us know, but we all could use a reminder, unlike American elections, are a two-step process. Even as I say that, I think, wow, we almost had a two-step process with our American election this time around, but it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
In Israel, it's meant to be. So first there's the election, and then based on the results of the election and which parties, and remember in Israel, you vote for a party, not for a candidate, which party gets the most seats, and the assumption of which party will have the easiest time building a coalition. In the entire 2-year history of the state of Israel, there has never been a government made up of a single party. There has only ever been coalitions built often in kind of contortionist positions by political parties that are really accommodating each other because they don't have a lot in common. But there has never been anything like what is about to be attempted starting tomorrow or today in Israel. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So once the election is held, usually, but not always, the party that wins the most votes is tapped by the president. The president in Israel is a head of state, like the Queen of England, with
fewer dogs,
fewer castles, a nice house, with no real political power beyond the bully pulpit, which is important, and with a lot of ceremonial power. So, but one of the actual things that the president is tasked with doing is giving the mandate to try to form a coalition to the person who he or she, the president, thinks is best able to build a viable coalition. So this time around, that was given to Benjamin Netanyahu, who emerged with the most number of seats for his Likud party. Now, this is the fourth election in 2 years. Remember, in just about 2 years in Israel. We're in an unprecedented, I would call it electoral, quasi-constitutional, quasi-crisis right now in Israel. They can't.
We're feling very Italian.
We're feeling very Italian, and also now the food is good in Israel. But no one has been able to put together a coalition government in over this period of time, except the short-lived government of national unity that emerged after the last third of these 4 elections, which was where Benny Gantz, the leader of the opposition Blue and White Party, which at the time won the most seats, was given a mandate. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's nickname in Israel is, among his nicknames, is the magician, right? And he really earned it last time because Gantz won the election, Blue and White won the election, but Netanyahu, Bibi, convinced him to join as the junior partner in a coalition government to fight COVID. That was his rationale, in which he, Bibi, the loser between the two parties, would assume a prime ministerial rotation first, right? So other people, and by other people I mean literally everybody else in the punditry in the political world and in Israel,
and everybody who voted for Benny Gantz
said, "Are you crazy? Bibi is never going to let you take up your seat.
Right.
Why are you going second?" I don't have the answer to that. He went into the government. Netanyahu, I believe, never had any intention of letting him serve. I believe the proof of that is in the pudding, because that government, when it became too problematic for Netanyahu, collapsed, and we went into the election that we had a few weeks ago, and now we're in step 2, forming a coalition. Again, before I return to what's happening right now, I want to say a quasi, and it's a lot of quasis, editorial comment. I say quasi-editorial because I think it's an informed. It's my opinion, and I think it's also very much the facts, right? The only reason that Israel is now in this crisis, in this logjam of election after election after election, and the odds, by the way, that there's a 5th election are at least even at this point in time. That would take place during the summer. There's only one reason why we're in that position, and that is because Prime Minister Netanyahu is desperately fleeing the trial that has begun on 3 very serious charges of corruption, and it's very unclear in the Israeli system what happens if a sitting prime minister is convicted, or whether or not he or she actually has to stand trial, to certain parts of the trial. But what is clear is if he can keep, he's in a much better position if he's the prime minister than he is if he's not the prime minister. And so establishing a coalition in which he's the prime minister is the first best choice, but the second best choice is just having another election and living to fight another day, right? Meanwhile, when he is in power, his number one goal is to pass something that in Israel and Hebrew is known as the French law, which would make it impossible for him to be tried as a sitting prime minister. The Knesset has not passed this law. So he is just spinning and spinning to try to avoid prosecution. There are other reasons for the political stalemate and deadlock in Israel, but none of them, in my opinion, are dispositive. The dispositive reason is that Benjamin Netanyahu feels that he needs to remain prime minister so he can avoid the long arm of the law, which is coming for him. So here's where we are. After the fourth election, the blue and white party, which won the third election, sort of collapsed. Now this isn't terribly surprising, because what happens in Israel over the last couple of decades is that large sort of centrist parties rise up, they form, and they fall apart. But the voters for those parties, whether that party is the original center-left party, the Labour Party, whether it's the blue and white party, whether it's Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert's Kadima party, whether it's Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party,
or his dad's Shinui party,
a generation earlier, they all occupy similar territory, right? Between the left wing of Labor and the Meretz party, the left wing Zionist parties, and all of the right wing parties is this big center. Its name changes, but its voters remain fairly constant. But one of the dynamics that's shifted over the course of the last 2 years is the growth of what is being called in the English press right now, and in Hebrew, the change camp, which could also be called the Rak Lo Bibi camp, the just not Netanyahu camp. And after this last election, the fourth election, bear with me, we're almost there, folks. After the fourth election, Netanyahu's Likud is the largest party with 30 or 31 seats, followed by Yesh Atid, which is again one of these centrist parties run by a former television personality turned pretty dogged politician. He's been doing this for a long time now. Yeah. And he was one of the parts of the blue and white party, right? They were part of a big centrist party. That party fell apart when Gantz went into the government. Yair Lapid gets 17 seats. And so everybody at midnight last night was holding their breath, wondering what the president would do. Because the president had, when Bibi was unable to form a coalition, several options. But first, why was Bibi unable to form a coalition? Bibi has the support of the two ultra-Orthodox parties, one Ashkenazi and one Mizrahi Sephardi, right? And he also has the support of a party that he essentially birthed and arranged. And that is a party that is a merger of an ultra right-wing pro-settler nationalist party, famous for anti-Arab invective, also homophobia, right? And an out-and-out Kahanist party, a party that follows in the footsteps of the late American-born Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was a proponent of I will call it Jewish fascism, certainly Jewish supremacy.
Ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing, right, so much so that in the 1980s, under the rule of Likud Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, they were banned. He was banned from running in the Knesset because of his racism. And still some of his most overt followers have been banned by the Elections Commission and the High Court of Justice as recently as during the last few elections from running. But you have to pass a pretty high threshold of racism and invective to get banned. And so some of his more mild-mannered, but they're not mild-mannered at all, followers at Bibi's urging merged with the other right-wing party to form a party called the National Religious Party, which is just what it sounds like, which is...
But no relationship to the historical National Religious Party.
Right. Which it all gets very, very complicated.
Which is now Yamina now,
yeah,
right.
So, but that's not enough, right? Those three parties plus Likud did not get...
That was 52 seats
It's 52
out of
seats.
120.
Exactly. You need 61 seats, as Gordon just said, out of 120 seats to make a government in the coalition. And Bibi didn't have enough. And then something really interesting happened. Or didn't happen. And that is one of the crazy stories of the last, let's call it 6 to 7 years of Israeli politics. I know there's a lot, folks, but I promise you, it will kind of make sense.
This is a good one.
It will kind of make sense when we're done. Just hang on. One of the most interesting stories of the last 6 or 7 years of Israeli politics was the rise of an organized, successful Arab-Israeli political voice. Arab Israelis have once upon a time tended to vote for small Arab Israeli parties and labor. Some would even vote for Likud. That changed. We don't have time to go into why it changed, but after 2000, that was no longer the case. And the Arab community voted for a series of small Arab parties, and many didn't vote at all. And the number of Arabs not voting, Arab citizens of the state of Israel, not voting was growing and growing and growing for decades.
And it's fully 20% of the population.
Yeah, it's 22% of the population is Arab, and their vote participation was declining, in part because they were exhausted, in part because they felt nobody is ever going to give them a fair shake, and it's hopeless and helpless. And of course, that kind of despair is not good for anybody. So still, these little Arab parties were annoying to Prime Minister Netanyahu and then Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, the head of a right-wing secular party backed by Russians called Israel Our Home, right? Israel Beteinu. And so Lieberman, back in 2013, came up with an idea worthy of Haman, in my opinion. And that is, he said, let's raise the electoral threshold, the percentage of the votes that you actually need to make it into the Knesset, to a level that is just higher than the level that the biggest Arab party reached in the last election, and will block them out. Their votes will all be wasted, right? Because people will divide their votes between these little parties. None of them will make the threshold, and 1 million plus Arab citizens, 20% of the state, will be completely disenfranchised. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, true to form, said, great idea. And the right-wing Knesset passed this law. But here's the Haman-like part, right? Having built the scaffold, what happened next was an obscure Arab Israeli legislator from Haifa, a secular Muslim guy called Ayman Odeh, who was the head of one of the small Arab parties called Hadash, which is actually traditionally an Arab Jewish party, a communist party, not anymore.
It's the Israeli Communist Party.
Right, it used to be a communist party. Now it's sort of a left-wing party.
It was always Christian small businessmen.
Yes,
right. Like
that's
I used to tease my Christian friends. I'm like, so you're a communist, right? You know,
and some of the real left-wing Jews.
Right.
It transformed over the years into the only real Arab Jewish party in the state of Israel. Ayman Odeh did something unprecedented, unbelievable, and astonishing. He took the 4 small Arab parties and he managed to merge them. Now, one of these was a former communist, very liberal party that he ran. 2 of them were Palestinian nationalist parties, Arab nationalist parties, and one of them was an Islamist party, the Israeli branch of a Muslim Brotherhood type of a movement. But they stitched together into a party called the Joint List, these 4 parties, and in the election, meant to knock Arabs out of the Knesset, they became the 3rd largest party in the state of Israel. And Lieberman's party collapsed almost to the point of falling below the threshold. He barely held on. So why am I saying this? Because into the equation of Israeli politics came the Arab sector, the Arab population of the state of Israel. There was one time in Israeli history, one time only, when Arab parties were part in some way of a governing coalition, not formally, informally. And that was during the period of Yitzhak Rabin's second premiership between 1992 and his assassination in 1995. Arab parties, they had 5 seats, the Arab parties. They were a blocking majority. So they sat outside the coalition because Jewish parties have traditionally never wanted to invite Arab parties into rule in the government. And the Arab parties, for their part, were very ambivalent about being part of a government that was undertaking an occupation of the West Bank, and sometimes fighting Arab states. So neither really wanted the Arab parties in the government, but Rabin said, if you support the peace process and keep us afloat, I will support your interests. And he did. And for this brief and shining moment, Arab interests were catered to, money went into the Arab sector, and they kept that government from... They paved some roads, they stopped the police department being built in Jerusalem, and most importantly, when Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi party, left the coalition in protest of the peace moves, the Arab parties kept Rabin in power. So Ayman Odeh and his Joint List, in the last 4 elections that we've had, in 2 of them, they have signaled that they would give that kind of blocking support to Benny Gantz and his blue and white party. In the second election, Gantz didn't really accept it. He sort of danced around it. But in the 3rd election, he said, okay. And the Arab parties said, we recommend Benny Gantz to be the prime minister. And Benny Gantz said, I will work with you as a blocking coalition. And then Bibi did his magic. And even though Gantz won the election, he ended up joining the coalition with Likud. What happened in the fourth election is, as things go in Israel, that Arab joint list split apart. The Islamist party left and ran alone. And so both parts, the more liberal part of the joint list and the conservative Islamist part, both passed the threshold, right? So now you had two Arab parties or two Arab blocs. But here's where things got really interesting. Netanyahu, where were we? 55 seats?
Right, yeah.
He's short. He needs more seats.
Right, he was at 52. Right.
He's at 52. So he needs, first of all, the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett, which before the National Religious Party I described earlier was the ferocious right-wing party, a Jewish supremacist party, but they look almost moderate in comparison to the new guys, but they're way to the right of the Likud, so they're right-wingers. So he needed the 7 seats that Bennett got, but that still wouldn't be enough. He'd be at 59. So how does he get to 61 seats when there are 2 other small right-wing parties that refuse? They're strongly part of the Just Not Bibi camp. Yamina was on the border. He needs the Arab party. He needs the breakaway Islamist party to join him. And the leader of the Islamist party, a guy named Mansour Abbas, no relationship to the head of the PA, also named Abbas, he decides he's going to go to the highest bidder, and he won't support, he won't pledge to support Bibi, and he won't pledge to support the change bloc. And he waits to see what will happen. And then the ferocious party on Bibi's right says, there's no way we'll ever sit in government with any of those terrorists. This is not me editorializing. That is what they call them. With these terrorists.
That's the most polite thing they've said about
them.
Right.
And so Bibi is now hoisted on his own petard, right? The guy who said the Arabs are coming to vote in droves, the guy who's used anti-Arab invective for his political rise, needs an Arab party, but his right-wing Kahanis group that he has brought into the Knesset says we won't sit with them, and that's why he couldn't come up with a government. So now we have the change bloc, right? The change, there's a lot of Schadenfreude that people might Now the change bloc is the most unwieldy collection of parties in the history of the state of Israel to ever get 3 weeks to a month to try to figure out if they can form a government, right? They are made up of the parties of the Zionist left, the Labor Party and Meretz, right, which are small. They have 13 seats between them, but not insignificant. The rest of the Arab parties, the Joint List Party, right, which has 6 seats now, 5 or 6 seats now. The Yesh Atid centrist party that has got the mandate now to try to build a government, which has 17 seats. The Yamina party of the ultra-right-winger Naftali Bennett, who has 7 seats.
Right.
And Gidon Sar, a former Likud official, a minister, an education minister. By the way, I just love this. The last name Sar in Hebrew is the same word as minister. So he was Sar, which sounds like something out of Joseph Heller. His breakaway from the Likud 6-party seat, and Avigdor Lieberman's Israel is our home, right-wing Russian party. So I just told you, Arab parties, leftist parties, rightist parties, and centrist parties. Also the blue and white party of Benny Gantz.
Right.
That's what makes up this. What my grandmother
and what unites them is a absolute loathing of
Bibi.
Yeah.
Now I would argue that there may be another thing that unites them, but we'll see. My grandmother would have called this an ungepatch, right? but so they all are united, as Gordon quite correctly says, in their desire to see Bibi gone. And part of the reason why many of them want to see Bibi gone is that there is a broad recognition, because that list of parties, including right-wing parties who should be with Bibi, a majority of Israelis, a clear majority of Israelis have come to the conclusion that Netanyahu must go, that he is a disaster for Israel's democracy. Despite the real successes of his premiership, regardless of whether you love him or hate him, he's had enormous successes internationally, domestically, but Israel is overwhelmingly ready for him to go. The question is whether that majority is going to be able to come together and come up with the terms of a government in order to come together to see Bibi leave. I would argue that the non-cynic in me thinks that there is something more than just a loathing of Bibi. There's a desire to get Israel back on track. There's a desire to try to have a national healing or unity government after COVID, Israel has not had a new budget in over 2 years now. So the old budget just turns over and over, despite the increases in expenses and the changes in need. So I think that there is, on the part of some of these folks, a real patriotism, a real desire to try to get Israel back in shape. If this works out, this will be a non-ideological government. It will come together on basic security concerns. We will not see growth of the settlement enterprise in any serious way. We will not see, but on the other hand, we will not see any sort of serious left-wing or liberal initiatives. It'll be a status quo government. I'll just say a couple of more words and then we can move on. One, without any ultra-Orthodox parties in the government, it raises an interesting question as to whether or not the government will actually take some moves in favor of religious pluralism and freedom of religion. But the answer is a real maybe, because Naftali Bennett and his Yamina party, which by the way means the right, he's a kippah-wearing guy, and he has largely trucked with the religious. But it's also not his thing, right?
Right.
So there may.
And he aligned with Yair Lapid a couple of governments ago to like push the ultra-Orthodox out for that short window.
And so there may be a coming together, depending on Bennett, of those forces who would like to see the ultra-Orthodox power in the country diminish. Now, the horrific tragedy at Har Meron last week, right in the midst of Lag BaOmer, where 45 people were trampled to death, and I know we'll talk more about that later, really goes to the level of control that the ultra-Orthodox parties have had on the current government and many previous governments in Israel. And here again, I'm horrified by what happened, and I don't want to engage in sort of glib political commentary, except to say the fact that that facility was in the terrible shape that it had been in. The regional, the sort of county official for that region in Israel had reported 3 times over the last year to his superiors in government, in the police department, this is a disaster, it's an accident waiting to happen, it's a death trap. So the local officials knew, but every attempt that they made to get it fixed were stymied ultimately by the prime minister, because doing so, making changes there, would anger the ultra-Orthodox parties. And that was not something that Netanyahu was ever going to risk doing. So there's a big question now as to whether or not there'll be the will to make some real changes in that department. And the last thing I'll say about this election is that just because Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party got the tap to form the government doesn't mean that he's going to be the next prime minister of Israel. In fact, the smart money is on the following scenario. In order to bring Yamina, that 7-seat right-wing party of Naftali Bennett, into the government, so to finally get Bibi out of there, they're going to have to agree to a rotation, right, where the prime ministership rotates, which it was supposed to be with Bibi and Gantz, and which Israel has done several times in the past. Right. And the rotation would be between Bennett and Lapid. And most of the smart money suggests that the deal would be Bennett goes first. He would be the prime minister of Israel for 2 years with 7 seats in his party. And then it would switch to Yair Lapid with his 17 seats. This is something that the Meretz and Labor Party and joint list parties would have to swallow if they're going to be in this government. This has been a guy who has been sort of enemy number one of the left in Israel and of the Arab community in Israel. And so we'll see if this government gets made. And if it does get formed, we'll see who the prime minister is, and then we'll see how long it lasts. But there is, I would say, the best chance that we've seen in recent years that there really will be a government without Bibi Netanyahu at its head.
Right. Yeah, that'll be interesting to watch. And it's, clear like the jockeying of, right, because Bennett had said at one point, like, well, I want all the ideological ministries. And everybody else was like, you can have, you can have this, but not that. Like,
right.
Pick one off the menu. So,
but can I ask you? That was quite an extraordinary
Sorry
answer.
for the long answer, but yeah.
A+.
Clock's in 15 minutes.
But why is this a good way to set up a government?
Well, no one ever said it was a good way to set up a government.
Why is this a lasting way to set up a government? How is Israel?
Well, they did try another
functional?
way. Well, so that's an interesting story. So they did try in the late 90s direct election of the prime minister.
They tried it one time.
Right. So Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon were both elected that way. But the idea was that it would make the small parties less powerful, right? Because it would hand the mandate to form a government to an individual, and then he would start to cobble together a government. And what happened was, law of unintended consequences, this is Israel's unofficial motto, is that they, people said, oh, great, I can vote for Likud or Kadima or whatever, and then I'll go vote for a small party. I'll vote for the prime minister that I like, and then I'll go vote for the most ideological party possible. And actually, there were more small parties in the parliament as a result of that.
But you're not wrong, because Bibi's last ploy, which failed.
Right. This is where it gets fun.
2 days ago, he came up with a great idea that we should have a fifth election and have a direct election of a prime minister, because he figures, and he may be right, that in a direct head-to-head contest, regardless of which party won the most votes, he would likely win, or he could win the most votes as prime minister. It's very unclear whether that would happen or not.
Right.
The problem is there aren't a lot of great, people don't like him, but there aren't a lot of great alternatives. But it's not a great system. You know, one might look at our political system last November and ask the same question. But you know, there are other parliamentary systems that work a lot more smoothly. If you look at England or Ireland, or the UK or Ireland, they have much more stable systems. But then again, those systems are not injected with the kind of lunacy and ideology that injects itself into Israel. There are possible ways around this. Some of them, you know, what Lieberman and Netanyahu tried to do was sinister, because they were doing it to destroy Arab political party. But there are those who think, well, if we had larger blocks, something a little bit more like the UK system, where it wasn't so many parties, but sort of the way it used to be in Israel, where you had Labour and the Likud, two big parties,
right. And then a couple of smaller satellite
and a
parties.
few smaller parties, maybe that's a better way. But the fact, I mean, there are all kinds of reforms that people talk about, as they talk about here, but the problem is they can't even put together a government to enact those reforms. One of the reforms that the change bloc has trumpeted that it wants to promote would be a law creating term limits for prime minister. So that would be one way, because as I said at the beginning of this long answer, the reason we're in this situation is because of the ego, vanity, political survival, and frankly, actual personal freedom of one man, of Bibi Netanyahu. And if there were term limits, this wouldn't be happening. So one of the things that the change bloc has signaled that it wants to do is pass a law saying you can serve 8 years. And this would add to some stability or it would take out an X factor in the Israeli political system.
Right. Of course, there are no districts. That's the other thing.
Right. No geography.
Right. So, and given it's the size of New Jersey, you might say to yourself, well, is that even practical? But if you look at England and Ireland and all these other places, that's exactly how Belgium, right? I mean, which is not much bigger. Finland, which has the same population, although a lot more trees.
Right. Ireland has 4.5 million people in it, but it's got geographic districts, and that creates a much more stable situation, because people are voting.
Right.
Why, you ask? Because people are voting locally.
Right.
They want the guy who's going to make sure the potholes get fixed. Right. And that's not an issue in Israel. The potholes just don't get fixed.
Right.
And also the incredible diversity of Israeli society, right? I mean, unlike, I don't know that much about Ireland, but I would imagine that in many other countries that have this kind of a system, there's much more uniformity of the population. Here, when you're dealing with so many different viewpoints, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, religions, I mean, you've got so many different people with different interests.
Yeah, that's right.
And it makes for a wonderful place to visit and kind of a difficult place to understand the political system because it's just so complicated on a day-to-day basis when these people are interacting with each other in every possible way. So along those lines, I want to ask you about civil society and sort of what's been going on during COVID. You know, vis-a-vis these different populations, the Arab population that are, you know, people that are citizens of Israel, the Arab populations around of people who are not citizens of Israel, the diversity of the Jewish population, including the ultra-Orthodox, and how is Israel handling COVID, and how are the different viewpoints kind of coming together to allow people to follow some rules? A few rules, I don't know.
Well, there are a lot of parallels between what we faced here in our enormous, vast country and what Israel faced when it's much smaller, both population-wise and geographical country, when it comes to COVID and the way different communities reacted. But one thing we should state from the outset, Israel's initial reaction to COVID and its ultimate vaccine program were exemplary. They were world leaders. And we got to hand it to the Israelis, you know, that's what a universal healthcare system will do,
right?
And lots of other things. But Israel had an infrastructure. You know, when you go to Israel, especially if you've ever been into the clinic, the terem, the medical system in Israel, you might think, boy, this is like barely controlled chaos. But Israel has pretty good healthcare. It's also, interestingly, a field in which Arab Israelis are able to rise to the highest levels: doctors, pharmacists, nurses. So
which is a legacy of the Soviet Union, oddly enough.
Interestingly,
right? Like a whole bunch of them went to the Soviet Union, got medical training, came back because the Soviet Union thought like, oh, well, like, cultivate these sort of this fifth column
to
within
join the
Israeli
Kadash party.
society. Yeah, exactly.
So you had a medical system that was, I wouldn't quite say it has it isn't beloved the way the national health system in Britain is beloved by Britons, but it is cherished by Israelis, and it is a sort of a melting pot of different kinds of Israelis, and it exists. Everyone has access to decent healthcare in Israel. So the first thing that happened was, so the initial response was good, and you asked about civil society, so I'll sort of tell you through the lens of New Israel Fund. When COVID hit, we looked at the situation and quickly said, okay, we need to be able to shift our resources and our response. Now, normally, as you all know, and as many folks who were with us tonight know, New Israel Fund, works to empower Israeli liberal civil society to help marginalized and minority communities take agency and fight for their own rights, to support those Israelis fighting for a fair shake for all Israelis in the economy of 21st century Israel, to support those folks who are doing civil rights and human rights work, and to support those folks who are trying to build a truly shared society between Israelis of all backgrounds, focusing particularly on Arab citizens of Israel, as well as monitoring and reporting on, and this is where NIF always takes the heat, on what Israel is doing in the West Bank in particular, in the occupied territories. So that's kind of what NIF does. When COVID hit, we realized we had to shift gears a little bit, because especially in those early months where we didn't know what was going to happen. And so we put together, we called it our crisis action plan, and we put together sort of a three-part set of priorities, and we shifted revenue and rather resources away from the things that we normally fund to pour into these areas. And those areas were, one, making sure that in Israel, as happens all over the world, including in our own country, the most marginalized and peripheral and minority communities were not left behind. The really decent response of the Israeli government to COVID, which was obviously much better than the response of the Trump administration to COVID. Need I say more? But not out of any, I personally don't believe, out of any malice, but rather oversight. The initial, that vital information, I mean, we can all remember what it was like in March of last year, when you just didn't even know what to think, and you were waiting for information, and the CDC was saying this and Trump was saying that, and
we were all just sitting around washing our hands thinking, well, is this enough?
We didn't know what to do. So in Israel, they didn't have the kind of anti-vax pandemic deniers in power that we had. You may say a lot of things about Netanyahu,
but he's not a denier.
No, he never pretended he believed in science. He never pretended this wasn't the global crisis that it was. So very quickly, information was put out there to help Israelis figure out how to navigate the horror of COVID, get the help they needed, find the resources they needed. But that information was put out only in Hebrew. And in Israel, you have massive populations, just like you said, Rabbi, a moment ago, for whom Hebrew is not their first or even necessarily a fluent language. You've got people, 22% of the population whose primary language is Arabic. You've got hundreds of thousands of people whose first language is Russian. You have tens of thousands of people whose first language is Amharic, Ethiopian Jews. You have tens of thousands of people who are sub-Saharan African political asylum and refugee seekers. You have tens of thousands of Thai workers. You have lots of people who just don't speak Hebrew.
A lot of people they speak Yiddish.
Sorry, I forgot one.
Right, and as an American, I will say a lot of us never really learned Hebrew decently enough, right? Like our joke was like, they'll tell you become bilingual. And really what you'll be is subliterate in two languages.
Right. So, you have New Olim who don't speak great Hebrew, and then you have hundreds of thousands of Yiddish-speaking ultra-Orthodox, and the information was not available to them. So NIF and our grantees, we turbocharged a campaign where we went both to the Ministry of Health and also to the High Court of Justice, asking the ministry and demanding at the High Court that information be made available in all the languages Israelis speak, and it was. So it was a very early, really gratifying, and I think quite important success, but it reflected the need to really shift to areas that we don't always fund in. I'll give you one other small example from that first category. NIF is a social, I always say, we're funding social justice as opposed to social service. Both of those things are super important, but whereas social service organizations are there to provide food for hungry people, social justice organizations are there to advocate in the halls of power to change policies and laws to make sure that fewer people are hungry, right? So really, that's what we focus on. There are tons of organizations in Israel working for social services, tons of American organizations working to help poor Israelis. But during COVID, something unprecedented in my tenure happened, which is that we got calls from some of our grantees in the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox community, grantee organizations that work with women who are trying to get a get, right? Agunot, women who have been denied a divorce by their husbands, so they can't remarry and they have no income coming in, and they're shunned by much of their own community, and they don't have the connections or trust of the central government. So these are people, these are like the ultimate outsiders. These, as they call them, it's an inelegant but very powerful English sort of quasi-translation, chained women, right? Women who, and they have no support from the community. And we got requests from some of the grantees that we fund who work to help unchain these women, right, in the ultra-Orthodox community. And they said they don't have food, and they don't have, and they're home with their kids because the schools are closed, and it's an ultra-Orthodox community, so they don't have books or games. So can NIF give us a grant so that we can provide food for these women who don't know how to get it otherwise, and books and games for their kids? And so I couldn't believe it, but I found myself approving an emergency grant to do just that, which I think was the right thing for us to do, but not the kind of thing that NIF has ever before been in the position of doing. The second category of response was we knew that the folks in power in Israel, some of them, just like the folks in power in America, would use the cover of COVID to further eviscerate or attempt to degrade aspects of Israeli democracy. And the best example of this that I can give was the court system. On May 1st, the justice minister, a Netanyahu loyalist would be a nice way to describe him, at 1 o'clock in the morning,
generous, but okay.
at 1 o'clock in the morning, when most Israelis are sleeping, ordered the civil court system to shut down. Now, that never happened in this country. Even in America, that didn't happen during COVID. There is Zoom. We're on it now. He ordered the courts to be shut down. Why? Because Netanyahu's trial was set to start that week. So we knew that they were going to use the excuse of COVID to do all manner of things. And one of those things was also the specter of annexation, right? Which Bibi had promised he would do if elected. He would annex territory in the West Bank, and which the Trump administration had seemingly given a green light for the Israelis to do.
A wink and a nod.
A wink and a nod, and maybe even more than that in the peace plan.
Right.
We funded emergency research at an incredible sort of think tank unit at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem to actually find out ways to talk to Israelis about the dangers of annexation to Israeli democracy. If you annex the occupied territories and you totally obviate the possibility of a two-state solution, then Israel has control over hundreds of thousands or millions, depending on what it does, depending on where it annexes, of people who are either living under Israeli control with no vote, no civil rights, or in little quasi-independent Bantustans in the Palestinian cities, totally controlled by Israel. Now, there's a name for this arrangement, right? But it isn't in English or in Hebrew, it's in Afrikaans. And so this think tank was researching, how do you message to Israelis that this is a grave danger? And before we had to actually to utilize that information, the Abraham Accords, peace treaties were signed, and the UAE and Bahrain demanded that Israel put on the back burner, or they actually demanded that Israel forswear any annexation if they wanted a peace treaty. And so Bibi, quickly, I think looking for a way to climb down the annexation tree, agreed to this, and annexation vanished. And then the third area where we
all for duty-free shopping,
all for duty-free shopping in the UAE. And then finally, we were committed to ensuring that none of our grantees sunk beneath the rising tides of economic distress that COVID left in its wake. And this reminded me of my very brief tenure, as some of my friends on this Zoom call will remember, here at the Federation, when I ran the Federation for 14 months, my tenure coincided with the crash in 2008, at the end of the Bush administration, before Obama was elected. And we also were faced with a situation where we thought Jewish community organizations are going to go under if we don't release funds to help them, which we did, and which I'm proud to say NIF did, and none of our grantees collapsed during COVID. So that's how we responded, and how civil society responded during COVID.
Wow. And, as you mentioned, and I think something the Jewish community is very proud of, Israel really has been a leader in this, right? I mean, in terms of vaccinations and in terms of getting some kind of herd immunity and trying to figure out how to reopen society. So how does all of that link together with this catastrophe of last week and sort of the ultra-Orthodox community? How have they responded to what the government's been asking for or what the health minister has been asking for?
Right. So one of the parts of Israeli society that did not subscribe to what the overwhelming majority of Israelis subscribe to in responding to COVID, where again, there was sort of a unified government population response. They took it super seriously. And then, then they didn't for a while, and things got out of control and very bad. And then they did again. And now they're in as good a shape as anyone in the world right now. But the ultra-Orthodox community did not take it seriously. And this leads to another difficult question, especially in the wake of the tragedy at Mount Meron. The ultra-Orthodox community, especially over the last 12 years of the Netanyahu government, for the reasons that I said before, because that government, all of his coalitions have been reliant on those ultra-Orthodox parties to stay in power. So Bibi has been reliant. But it goes back before Bibi, where these parties have been kingmaker parties for a very long time.
Well, since 48.
Since 48. And nobody wants to rock the boat. And since 48, they've gained and gained and gained in power. And they do not, you all know, people who are watching this Zoom know that in 2012, the big massive social protests were called Machane Freier, the suckers camp. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets saying, we're tired of shouldering the burden of defense of this country, of national service for this country, when there are hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens who don't recognize the sovereignty of the state of Israel, who don't care about the state of Israel at all, who refuse to pay taxes, who refuse to pay and serve in the army, who we as Israeli citizens subsidize their Torah study, and we've had it, we're done. And it looked for a moment like things might change, but of course they didn't change for the reasons that I said before. When it came to COVID, those communities did not take it seriously at all. Some of them were sort of anti-vax, sort of COVID denier types. And some of them just ignored and flaunted the serious health restrictions on public gatherings. So you would have funerals for rabbis or weddings of Hasidic aristocracy that became super spreader events. And at certain points in time, cities like Bnei Brak, largely ultra-Orthodox city, not far from Tel Aviv, and parts of Jerusalem were COVID red zones on the planet, out of control COVID. And as one of my Israeli family members said to me recently, if it hadn't gotten better, there could have been a civil war between us and them. That's what she said. So, this is whether or not that's an accurate assessment. That was very much the feeling of sort of secular mainstream Israelis about what was happening. Because the situation got better, those tensions receded a bit. But, and I guess the cynic in me thinks, if the situation didn't change in terms of ultra-Orthodox, what they call autonomy, right? And I think that is a very apt description, right? A big section of the Israeli population for whom the laws and requirements of citizenship don't really apply, right? Could you imagine if the Arab Israeli population decided that it wanted that kind of autonomy? Or for that matter, the kibbutznikim, the so-called elites, but for the ultra-Orthodox, they simply don't apply. And if we were, and again, I choose my words carefully in the wake of the horror of last week, but if during COVID, the Israeli state wasn't able to come to terms with the autonomy that the ultra-Orthodox were wielding in refusing to obey COVID restrictions, at a point when non-Orthodox Israelis were being affected, they were being infected by COVID. It was spreading because of
and people
these
were told
communities.
You couldn't leave. It was 50 meters from your house.
So
right? Like far
that's
more
right.
draconian than anything we experienced in this country.
That's right. And if that didn't snap the Israeli government into action saying, wait, things have gone too far, you guys need to play by the same rules, then I don't know why we think that a horrific tragedy that affected, in terms of the victims, only parts of that community that doesn't want to be reined in, that doesn't want government regulation, would make a difference. I don't think it will. I think what will make a difference, if anything, is if a government comes to power that is not beholden and dependent upon ultra-Orthodox parties for its power, and says, look, we're going to not necessarily restrict what you do, but we're going to have civil marriage. You don't get to control who marries whom and who divorces whom and who gets buried where they get buried. And that's, I think, the only hope is in shrinking the space of control that community has, and thereby sort of reasserting some of the power of the state over those realms.
Right. Rule of law.
Yeah.
What a concept.
Abe Foxman once told me, the legendary former director of the ADL.
Oh, yeah.
He once said to me, he said, there's no democracy in the world that has more laws on the books that it doesn't actually enforce than Israel.
Yeah, I would say as an Israeli citizen, I can't disagree with that.
Well, what about Jewish pluralism? Since you brought up
Right.
that topic, that matters a whole lot to us here as Reform American Jews. How are things looking?
Well, again, I mean, the answer to that is sort of the flip side of the answer to what I just said. You know, we Sherith Israel and the New Israel Fund and the Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist and Emergent and Renewal movements of Judaism are all united, right, in fighting for recognition and pluralism within Israel. But there's a very famous story, probably anecdotal, but I still love it, that when Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir were having the rotations, the prime ministerial rotations back in the 80s, and the who is a Jew controversy was raging. This is when the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, which is a state rabbinate, declared that conversions by Reform and Conservative rabbis were invalid and that we weren't really Jews. A bunch of American Jewish leaders went to meet with the newly rotated Shimon Peres. What a relief. You know, Peres was the prime minister, not Shamir. And they said, why don't you do anything about who is a Jew? You agree with our position? And Shimon Peres said, yes, I do. And they said, well, then why don't you make this a priority? And he said, why don't you send 200,000 American liberal Jews on Aliyah? So this is not an issue that is at the top of the Israeli agenda. The issue of pluralism, I'm just being honest. We are proud supporters of Women of the Wall, right? As I'm sure you guys all are, the great Anat Hoffman, who I basically just do what she tells me many times over the course of any given year. Israelis, by and large, don't really care about that issue at all. In fact, some of them think we're nuts for wanting to have the right to pray at what is essentially an ultra-Orthodox synagogue at the Western Wall. And so sometimes I think of my job as the CEO of NIF when it comes to this issue as being the translator in chief. And so to my Israeli brothers and sisters, I say, you have to understand, you guys, Israelis, told us, American Jews, that this was the symbol of everything, the Western Wall. You sold that to us. You're the ones who told us how important it was that Israel have sovereignty, that it become a sacred space. You took us there on our trips, on our bar mitzvah trips, our birthright trips. You make it the centerpiece of everything. You talk about the eternal undivided Jerusalem, and then you're surprised that we want the same rights as any Jews when you come to the wall. You have to understand that we do want that. And you think it's crazy that we feel so strongly that the Reform Synagogue in Mevaseret Zion should be recognized in the same way as the ultra-Orthodox synagogue. You think it's nuts, but that's because you don't understand our Judaism, right? You, in a way, have imbibed this notion that the only real Jews are the ultra-Orthodox Jews and everybody else is secular. But we, American diasporic Jews, we don't feel that way. And that's what I say to our Israeli cousins, right? And what I say to my American and British and Australian brothers and sisters when I speak for NIF is, you have to understand, they care about the control of the ultra-Orthodox over who their children can marry. And God forbid, if their child dies fighting for Israel in the IDF, but is not halachically Jewish, they care that their kid doesn't get to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, right? And they care about control over divorce and all of these different things in the hands of the rabbinate. They don't really care about praying at the Western Wall or whether the synagogue is recognized. They care about this control over their lives. And what I think is the powerful alliance is when we recognize that those are essential issues and our Israeli brothers and sisters recognize that ours are essential issues. And then we can pressure a government that doesn't contain ultra-Orthodox parties to make changes. So again, I mean, that's, you know, NIF is dedicated and we will never stop laying the groundwork for those changes when that day comes. We'll always support organizations that do make small but significant advances. There are advances in the recognition, different types of recognition of reform and non-Orthodox Judaism in terms of state funding. But I don't believe that until the politics in Israel change, or the political leadership in Israel change, the alignment changes, that there's going to be a real ripeness for this change. And I think the best shot when that day happens, when it comes, is for a united global and Israeli non-Orthodox Jewry to say, look, enough. So that's not a terribly optimistic perspective, but
no, but I think it's realistic, and I think it's important for us to hear and understand, because we need to find a way to connect to Israel and to be engaging with Israel, even while that's true.
Right.
Well, I think that's a great point, Rabbi. That's a really great point. And it's a point that I find I make a lot of times in other contexts, but I'm learning. I think that you just gave me some great instruction, right? I'll often say to people, look, so Israel doesn't look beautiful to you. It makes you upset. It makes you angry. Think about how the Trump administration and America during Trump looked to all of our friends in Western Europe, right? Does loving and connecting with the idea of Israel mean that you have to be in lockstep support with the policies and politics of the government any more than it does being a patriotic American? Of course not. But I think you add a great layer there, which is, it feels really terrible that officialdom in Israel rejects us and doesn't recognize us. I'm sitting, folks, in this synagogue, and the stained glass windows up above, as we were discussing before we went on here, show, the children of Israel gathered at Sinai, but instead of Sinai, it's Half Dome, right? So like, we are a proud and powerful
We had to
Jewish...
make reservations very early to get there, by the way.
Right, the Alwani's book. We're a proud and powerful Jewish community, and I don't think we should not let the fact that we're not respected by the officialdom in Israel stop us from building a relationship with Israel and with Israelis. So it's a crappy situation, and we'll work to help the Israelis who are trying to change it. But we shouldn't take that rejection as a reason to turn away.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'm going to throw it to you for a closing question, because I can't believe it, but it's 3 minutes to
wow,
6.
3 minutes to 6. Well, thank you very much. This has been great. And I think, one of the points of curiosity for people is, okay, what can I, so one of the things I always say to people, like, let's send an email. I'm like, what's your action? What's your call to action? So, what's your call to action? What should people do?
Well, first of all, let me just say, we'll cover more ground if we do this not the day after the most insane election development of the last 3 years, but we had to talk about it because it's on all of our minds.
Right.
Look, what I would say, and when I'm asked that question, and I'm asked that question a lot, is
really
is that we should engage, right? That we should. It's a follow up to what you and I were just saying. That we should engage. That the thing to do when Israel gets you down or makes you angry or confuses you is not to walk away. It's to realize that this is actually a dream that's worth fighting for. That there is an astonishing beauty to this idea, just as there is to the idea of our own country, right? The idea that the Jewish people, hounded and persecuted for millennia, finally has a shot at making it in the world is a beautiful thing, and that it's seemingly gone off the rails for a lot of us, and I feel in many ways directionally it has gone off the rails, is no more reason to walk away from that fight than it would have been in the depth of Jim Crow to walk away from the civil rights movement here. And what I say to young folks to whom I speak is, right, we were too young.
You're saying we're old.
I'm saying that we are now no longer young folks, but I think the three of us, I don't know for sure, but I was born after 1967, right? And I know you were too, and I think you were
in 1967 yourself.
So we're three middle-aged Jews sitting here at this table and one young one
I resemble that.
who never knew a day where Israel was not defined by the moral ambiguity of the occupation, right? And we're also three middle-aged Jews who missed the civil rights movement, youthful, in America. But we have an opportunity. There's a civil rights movement in Israel right now, and our brothers and sisters there need our help. They need us to stand with them. And so, to my mind, that's an incredible and exhilarating mission in life, right? It's a big, hard task. But what you do is you roll up your sleeves and you get engaged. And obviously for me and for many people on this call, and certainly for the rabbi, like for a lot of us, New Israel Fund has been that vehicle, because it's a way of not, a lot of people get involved in I think what you were sort of leaning to, the sort of fire off an email or bloviate,
right,
or hot air. And at New Israel Fund, it's all about saying we're standing shoulder to shoulder with those actual Israelis who are working every day to build a better, fairer country and to realize the vision in the 13th paragraph of Israel's Declaration of Independence that says Israel will be a place for the ingathering of the exiles, a homeland for the Jewish people that desperately needed one, but also an open, equal society for all of its residents. And that to me is a great charge. And that's essentially the mission statement of the New Israel Fund.
Well, you know what I found so meaningful when I went on my first NIF trip was that I came home so stirred up. I saw so many things and I experienced so many parts of Israel that are part of the beauty and the complexity and the diversity of society in Israel that I knew nothing about. On previous trips and times I had lived in Israel, I had seen all kinds of beautiful things in Israel and never understood a lot of what was going on behind the scenes. It was really complicated. And addressing that and learning about that was painful. I remember sitting in cafe after cafe after cafe, scribbling and just writing in a journal and writing to friends and sending emails and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But it made me feel ever more engaged with Israel and feel like there was something that I had to go and do, not just to become a visitor, but really to engage with Israel. So I think that, you know, though I felt tortured, I think that torture was in a way a connection to something that I love so much that I wouldn't walk away from, because otherwise the complexity could have caused me to just shrug and say, well, you know, it was nice to visit. Thanks. Next
How does
time.
that expression go? Lo alecha.
Right.
There you go.
Not for you to finish the work. I think that's beautifully put. I run the New Israel Fund, and I have bookshelves full of little black notebooks that I scribble in every time I go. Look, I think that was beautifully said. And that for me is the charge, right? You don't walk away, you engage, you roll up your sleeves, and this is a fight worth fighting.
Well, and you know, this, I'm going to look here because I'm not exactly sure.
There's a camera.
I'm going to look this way. And to say, but Daniel, to you, this series from the front lines began at the beginning of COVID for the exact reason that you were just talking about a few minutes ago. It was impossible to get information. And we realized that there was so much disinformation or lack of information out there that in some way we had so much expertise locally and people that we trusted, and we wanted to start to get some kind of information in this kind of sea of, you know, fogginess. And we realized as we began these conversations from the front lines that there were so many issues that were popping up in our society, especially during this time of COVID, but throughout, that required some real unpacking and some expertise and some local expertise from friends and people that we trusted, so that the disinformation that's out there would be turned into real, you know, information that we could use. And so we've had conversations about everything from anti-racism to the vaccines to, you know, we've been all over the place. And I think what has united these conversations is a real interest in talking about current events and talking about what's impacting us as a Jewish community, as an American Jewish community, as a San Francisco Jewish community, and during this time of COVID, when the whole world is coming together in a different way, through tragedy and struggle, and also science and all the things that are bringing us together. So this is very much aligned with the mission of this From the Frontline conversation series, because it's happening now and it's part of who we are, and it's all intertwined. So you couldn't have come at a better time. Thank you so much for being with us. Well,
thank you so much for having me. And look, one day we'll be able to travel to Israel again. And when we do, you should all come with us at New Israel Fund, just like the rabbi did. We'll torture you in a good way, just like we did her. And check the website for when we resume that. We will do it as soon as we can. And thank you all. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for joining.
So I think we wanted to squeeze in a word from Orly Bine. Is she available? Orly, you out there?
I'm here. I know
hi, Orly.
I'll do this. Hello, everyone. That was great. And I'll do this really quickly because I know people are wrapping up. I just wanted to share a few of the coming up opportunities, including one tomorrow. There's 3 things that you can get involved in coming up soon. And actually, they're on the inspiring side, right? Like not the deflating news, which sometimes we are bombarded with, but looking at the arts. So tomorrow we have a program called Activism, Art, and Hope, which will be with 3 groundbreaking Israeli artists and a photojournalist kind of taking us through some of the key events of the past year and looking at it through the lens of activism and art. That's tomorrow at noon. It's in the chat. You are welcome to sign up. And then we also have a film club. I think a few people here might have participated in it. It's monthly now. And NIF is in partnership with the Other Israel Film Festival, has a film, an Israeli film every month. You get to then watch it on your own and then join a conversation with the filmmaker. It's a wonderful opportunity, and also like can be uplifting, engaging, getting into some of the more complex or less talked about issues. And then last but not least, we are going to have another virtual gala this year. Many of you already have heard that we are having it in October. So save the date, October 24th. It's a Sunday. And I hope to see many of you. And I just want to say hello. There's so many wonderful people and familiar faces here. So I'm sending lots of love and hellos to everybody that I know on here, and hoping to be with you in person sometime soon. Hi.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you all very much. Have a lovely evening. For those of us here, we're going to have a cookie. Cookie? You have to have a cookie.
I'll take your cookie.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, all.
Good night.